Alright guys, now that we've gone over the basic cell parts, we're going to dive into the cell membrane and then why it's so important so materials can get transported in and out of cells as they need. Okay? Alright, so as you look at the picture here of the cell membrane, I think you'll notice that it's not just the line that we kind of draw around the outside of the cell. Okay? It is actually called a lipid bilayer. And of course, I think you can interpret from that bi meaning two. It's actually two layers, and the reason it's called a lipid bilayer is because it's mostly made of fats. Okay? There are some proteins and carbohydrates embedded in there, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Remember that all cells have a cell membrane. Okay? It's also called a plasma membrane in case you see that. I'm old school and I learned cell membrane, so that's kind of what I'm stuck with. Okay, and just remember that the cell membrane is responsible for what goes in and out of the cell. So we learned that term homeostasis the first week of school. Okay, it's what allows things in and out, controls water balance, food balance, and all those kind of things. Okay, all right, so let's look at the structure of the cell membrane. I want you to think of it kind of like a sandwich. It has a top layer of bread and a bottom layer of bread and then all the stuff in between. Each one of these things that looks like a balloon with two tails, okay, here it is. It's called a phospholipid, meaning it's made out of phosphorus and fats. Okay, the head, or like the balloon part, is hydrophilic. So if you remember your Latin or root words, that means it loves water. So that means it can dissolve in water. And then the two tails are hydrophobic, which means water-fearing. In other words, they do not dissolve in water. So if you think of these as the fatty parts and this part as the non-fatty part, that'll help you. Okay, so the reason it partially dissolves in water is so it's easily for water and oxygen and other materials to pass through. Okay, so I'm going to print this to PDF for you so you don't have to worry about labeling and doing all this. But I wanted to show you the basic parts here. Okay, so we talked about the hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails and all those things. Okay, here's your lipid bilayer. It's two pieces, right? Like that sandwich. We do have cholesterol in our cell membrane, and that gives it a little bit of strength. So when someone says they have high cholesterol, it's not pertaining to this. Everybody needs a little bit of cholesterol. Okay, and then we have a lot of proteins in here. These are called peripheral proteins because they're just on the outside. These are called integral proteins because they go all the way through, almost like if you stick a toothpick through your sandwich, okay, and you can see it on the top and the bottom. They give it strength too. And then we also have protein channels. If you notice, it's an empty channel through there, and that's how larger molecules can get in and out, okay? And then we also have these carbohydrate chains up here, and I want you to think of them like little antennae. When they touch each other, these cells can communicate with one another, okay? Not like talking back and forth like you would think communicate, but like with chemical signals and stuff, okay? All right, so what types of things do you think need to move in and out of a cell? I want you to think about just like you in general. You need oxygen, you need food, you need water, and then on the other hand, you also need to get rid of waste products like carbon dioxide, extra water, other waste products, and things like that. Okay, so we need to talk about how they move in and out of the cell. All right, so there are actually 4 terms here that you need to know, and the first one is diffusion. This is when any particle moves from where there's a lot of them to where there's a little of them, and the cell does not have to spend any energy for this to happen. Okay? So a silly example of this is if your mom is in the kitchen or you're in the kitchen and you're cooking bacon or brownies or collards or anything that smells really strong, doesn't that smell move from in the kitchen where it's really strong like all over the house? Okay? Or when you take an air freshener and do the same thing. Or when someone goes in the bathroom and completely blows it up. So the smell can move from where it's highly concentrated to where there's none at all until it's even, okay? Seems like for a few days in your house you can smell the bacon no matter where you are. All right, so another example of that is if I put this cube of sugar in here, over time it will diffuse out and it'll be equal in the entire beaker. Okay, so diffusion high to low concentration, no energy required. All right, the next one is facilitated diffusion. Now, this one is still diffusion, so they're still going from a high concentration to a low concentration, okay, down the gradient, as they say. But the difference here is it needs a channel to go through, okay? If someone facilitates something, that means they lead it. So in other words, this big particle here can't fit through the phospholipids, so it goes through a channel instead, okay? But if you'll look at this picture, you see how there are 4 of these particles inside the cell and only 2 outside. So I want you to think of it like we've got to be even Steven here. So in order for that to happen, what would we need to do? One of these would need to move through this channel out here, right? And then it would be 3 and 3. That's what we mean by facilitated diffusion, okay? Glucose molecules or things that are a little bit bigger need to do facilitated diffusion. Okay? All right, the next one is osmosis, and it is the exact same thing as diffusion, except this is strictly dealing with water. So if you guys see anything about water moving in and out of a cell, I want you to automatically associate that with osmosis, okay? Osmosis is a form of diffusion, but it's specialized because it only deals with water. And again, it's going down the gradient with the gradient, no energy required. Okay, so high to low, water only. All right? Okay, and then the last one here, active transport. This is the exact opposite of the other 3. Okay, I want you to think of it this way. When you're active, what do you need to be active? Well, you have to have energy. Okay, so what happens with active transport, instead of things moving from high to low, right, where there's 8 to where there's 2, or where there's 20 to where there's 10, they go against the gradient or up the gradient. They go from low, where there's already a low number, to where there's a high number. Okay? It's almost like if you had 2 biology classes at the same time and one teacher had 20 students and the other teacher had 10 students. Instead of putting it in the room where there were 10 students, you put it in the room where there are 20 students. All right? And the reason for this is a lot of times this happens like in muscle cells. We have something called a sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so do you see how there's 2 diamonds here and there's what, 5 diamonds here? But it is forcing these diamonds into the heavy side already. Okay, and whenever you see this little sunburst in here with the term ATP, which I have not used enough this semester and I apologize for that, that means energy. So if you ever see this sunburst, I automatically want you to think energy. And then when you think energy, I want you to think active. So your correct choice would be active transport. Okay? All right. So 2 other terms that may come up. Endocytosis. In means in. So this is when a cell brings a large particle in and it does require energy for that. Okay? Think about it like you didn't cut up your meat into a small enough piece and it requires extra chewing. Okay? Takes energy to do that. And then the opposite, exocytosis, this is when you're getting large particles out. Okay, so EX means exit. Again, requires energy. So exocytosis and endocytosis are 2 forms of active transport. Okay? All right, so guys, I want to use the example here just to show you what happens with water with osmosis, because that's the most common thing on the exam. Okay, so if we have this saltwater Nemo fish here, and we put him into a freshwater tank, let's talk about what happens, okay? Let's say he's used to 80% water and 20% salt, and these freshwater fish, of course, are 100% water. Guys, I'm just making up numbers, okay? It is nowhere near that big of a deficit. But if I take him and I put him into this tank here, let's pretend this him, okay? He is an 80 and the environment is 100. Remember, we're moving from high to low, okay? So that means the water will actually move into this particular fish, okay? So he is going to, all of his cells, I want you to imagine every cell in his body, they are going to swell up and explode. So therefore that saltwater fish will die, okay? If we do the opposite, right? He's a freshwater fish who's used to 100, and we put him in here in a saltwater tank. Okay, we're going to put him in here, and let's pretend that's this guy. Remember, he's used to 100, but now there's 80. This number is bigger than this number. So the water is going to leave his body. So every one of his cells are going to shrink. So all of his cells are going to shrivel up, and then he's going to die. Okay? So what I want you to remember is salt shrivels or shrinks, and fresh water makes things swell. Okay? So a good example of this is like if you lost a tooth or if you have a sore throat. I bet your grandmother said to swish with salt water, right? Or maybe even your mother. For my grandmother, salt water was the answer for everything, okay? But the reason is salt water shrinks things. So if you have a swollen throat or a swollen gum where you just pulled a tooth out, okay, that salt water is going to shrink those tissues. So it is actually a legitimate little cure there, okay? Fresh water, on the other hand, swells things. So think about, for the salty shrink, think about like when you take a cucumber and you put it in salt and vinegar and water and stuff to make pickles. Don't they get floppy? Okay? Just like when you have strawberries and you put a lot of sugar on them, they get watery and they get soft. Okay? So not only does salt shrink materials, too much sugar would do the exact same thing. Okay? So the only way to keep this balanced is if your two solutions are actually equal with one another. Okay? So if we look at these red blood cells here, this is under normal conditions. These have swollen up. So what kind of condition would they be put in? Fresh water, that's right. And then these have shriveled all up. So what kind of condition have they been put in? Probably salty water. Okay? All right, so let's just use these examples and then we'll stop for the day, okay? If we have a 60% solution on the outside and a 30% in the cell, which one is bigger? Obviously the 60, right? So the water is going to move in to this cell or bag or whatever we're using. So in this case, that cell or bag would swell, okay? If we put this one in here, there's more on the inside than on the outside. So in this case, the water would exit, so this cell would shrink. Okay? So the only way the cell is going to stay the same is if the two solutions are isotonic, or in other words, equal. All right? Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some practice on diffusion, osmosis, active transport, facilitated diffusion. Just do your best. This is actually a pretty hard topic for kids to get. And if you have any questions or concerns, just email me or give me a call. Thank you.